Hi, welcome back to NonCompete. I'm American Johnson.
And this is Luna.
And today we're going to be talking about the Bourgeois Proletariat. And I think we should just jump right in because there's a lot to go over. So what is the Bourgeois Proletariat? Well, first let's talk about what it's not. It should not be confused with the petty bourgeoisie. We've talked about this subject a few times on our live streams, and people always ask, are you talking about the petty bourgeoisie? No, we're not.
No.
The petty bourgeoisie, very specifically defined by Marx and Engels as people who basically own their own means of production. Real quick, class structure according to Marx. You got your capitalist class, aka the bourgeoisie. They make money via the MCM mode of circulation. We have a great video on that in which Luna dances and we both rap.
MCM is money commodity to money, to more money.
And if you want to learn more about that, you can check out our class time video, link in the description. But suffice to say, they basically make money by investing money. They don't make money through labor. The petty bourgeoisie are people who kind of like run their own business, so to speak.
Yeah,
they own
like
their own
small scale industry kind of business.
But they still have to labor to make that means
and
of
they
produce.
even though they own their own means of production, but they still get exploited by the rich bourgeoisie.
And they have things in common with the bourgeois proletariat, which we will talk about later, but they're not the same thing at all. The bourgeois proletariat is not a class. The proletariat are the working class. They're the people who work and use the means of production.
Sell their labor to the capitalists to get money to buy commodity, CMC.
They use the CMC mode of circulation, exactly. Capitalists own the means of production. The proletariat or the working class work on the means of production and are exploited by the capitalists, okay? Hopefully y'all are sort of familiar with that by now. There's an element, however, of the proletariat, especially in the imperial core, but not only in the imperial core, because there are people like this in, for instance, Vietnam and other imperialized countries. These are people who side with the bourgeoisie. They side with the capitalist class because they believe they benefit from capitalism, or they just have been fooled into believing that capitalism is the best possible system. And indeed, some of these people may have short-term limited benefits from capitalism, or especially from imperialism. So basically, the bourgeois proletariat are just workers who have false consciousness and love capitalism and side with the bourgeoisie against their own fellow workers.
That'll show those poor.
Why are you cheering, Fry? You're not rich.
True, but someday I might be rich, and then people like me better watch their step.
And I would dare say that the majority of workers in the USA and most of the imperial core at this point have developed into a bourgeois proletariat mindset, but we'll talk more about that. First, let's talk about the origin of the term. There was a fella named Ernest Jones in jolly old England in the 19th century. He was a leader of the Chartist movement. And this was an earlier British movement to create a charter. That's why they called themselves Chartists. A contract with Parliament, with the monarchy, to benefit British workers. This was in the early 19th century, like in the 1830s and 40s. Marx and Engels believed strongly in the cause of the Chartists. Okay, they thought they were cool. And they thought that they had a lot of revolutionary potential in the 1840s. So Ernest Jones joined the Chartists in 1845. He quickly rose to prominence. He gave a lot of speeches. He wrote poetry that was, sort of class conscious about the workers' struggle in England. He actually went to prison for 2 years in 1848 for some of those seditious speeches that he wrote. And upon his release from prison, he started a newspaper called Notes to the People. He launched another paper in 1852 called People's Paper, which Marx actually submitted 25 articles to. And Marx described Ernest Jones around this time as the most talented, consistent, and energetic representative of Chartism. And he praised him in several articles. So Marx, at this point in time, thought Ernest Jones was really a rad dude, liked where he was going, liked the Chartists, and Marx and Engels supported Ernest Jones a great deal. Until 1858, when Ernest Jones suddenly basically turned his back on the working class, and Marx wrote to Friedrich Engels, "Our friend Jones has decidedly sold himself, but at the lowest possible price, to the bright coterie. The idiot has ruined himself politically without rescuing himself commercially. That's like a lot of shade Marx is throwing at Ernest Jones. He's basically saying like he sold himself out to the capitalists and he didn't even get a lot of money out of it. But how little his apostasy. The laddie is preaching union of the middle and working classes has availed him. He has sold the People's Paper to the Morning Star fellows, has retained a mere couple of columns of the sheet for himself, and is, moreover, already at loggerheads with his new allies over the financial terms. Drama! So Ernest Jones sold his newspaper to some bourgeois jerks. Marx says, it'll be evident to you from the fact that the day before yesterday he went to Freiligrath and handed him a letter in German in which he asked for £4, failing which he would be locked up. And Freiligrath told him to address himself to our friend Gilpin. That Gilpin is managing director of the Switzerland Bank and of the paper which Jones has incorporated himself. So Ernest Jones got in very deep with some capitalist butt heads. Marx was real mad, wrote a letter to Engels. This is where Engels wrote back to Marx and coined the term bourgeois proletariat in October 1858. The Jones business is most distasteful. He held a meeting here, and the speech he made was entirely in the spirit of the new alliance between workers and petty bourgeoisie kind of thing. After that affair, one might almost believe that the English proletarian movement in its old traditional Chartist form must perish utterly before it can evolve in a new and viable form. So Frederick Engels and Marx are both pretty upset about this. They think that the Chartist movement has basically reached a dead end. It seems to me, by the way, that there is in fact a connection between Jones's new move seen in conjunction with previous more or less successful attempts at such an alliance and the fact that the English proletariat is actually becoming more and more bourgeois. So the ultimate aim of this most bourgeois of all nations would appear to be the possession, alongside the bourgeoisie, of a bourgeois aristocracy and a bourgeois proletariat. So basically what Engels is saying here is, because England is so wealthy, because it has exploited so many colonial holdings around the world, the British working class, or certain elements of the British working class, have benefited financially, and it's therefore easy to basically bribe them and win them over to the cause of the capitalist class. Now, to me, this is foreshadowing of fascism. Because if you've watched my video, well, I have a few videos now on like early fascism in the USA, and I did a documentary version of one of Parenti's great speeches on fascism. This whole idea of the national proletariat and the national bourgeoisie uniting together, that's exactly what the fascists preached. I think this is kind of like a nascent form of overt fascism that Engels and Marx were seeing develop in their day. And there are huge parallels between what Marx and Engels were describing and seeing then with what's happening carte blanche writ large in especially the USA today. Now in 1870, this was well over a decade after the whole Ernest Jones thing, Karl Marx wrote a letter to someone named Siegfried Meyer in which he talked about the English proletariat and its relationship with the Irish proletariat. And you'll see why this is all related shortly.
Very interesting.
Marx wrote, every industrial and commercial center in England now possesses a working class divided into two hostile camps, English proletarians and Irish proletarians. The ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowered his standard in life. In relation to the Irish worker, he regards himself as a member of the ruling nation, and consequently he becomes a tool of the English aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland, thus strengthening their domination over himself. You can see this kind of bourgeois proletariat mindset being described here. They're siding with the bourgeoisie against their fellow workers because of this national chauvinism, basically. He cherishes religious, social, and national prejudices against the Irish worker. His attitude towards him is much the same as that of the poor whites to black people in the former slave states of the USA, which we still, which we saw back in the 20th century and still see to this day now. It's that same kind of racial division of the working class. It's amazing that, Marx and Engels were able to describe this so early. The Irishman pays him back with interest in his own money. He sees in the English worker both the accomplice and the stupid tool of the English rulers in Ireland, which this is really interesting because it parallels things Ho Chi Minh said about Vietnamese and French workers, which we'll talk about later. But basically, the Irish and the English workers, instead of uniting together against their common real foe, material foe, which is capitalism, they're divided and they're attacking each other and seeing each other as competitors. Which is exactly what the bourgeoisie wants. They want us to be fractured and divided, right? This antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, in short, by all means at the disposal of the ruling class. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class despite its organization. It is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, and the latter is quite aware of this. So this is amazing. This is Karl Marx identifying very early the ways in which national and racial and other sorts of divisions are sowed intentionally by the capitalist class to keep workers oppressed, to keep us divided, to keep us conquered.
Exactly. Divide and conquer tactic.
And this was, like a full, 60 years before the rise of the Nazi Party in World War II.
Yeah.
So this was all happening in the 19th century, right? But the evil did not stop there, writes Marx. It continues across the ocean. The antagonism between Englishmen and Irishmen is the hidden basis of the conflict between the United States and England. It makes any honest and serious cooperation between the working classes of those two countries impossible. It enables the governments of both countries, whenever they think fit, to break the edge off the social conflict by their mutual bullying and, in case of need, by war between the two countries. England, the metropolis of capital at that time, the power which has up to now ruled the world market, is at present the most important country for the workers' revolution, and moreover the only country in which the material conditions for this revolution have reached a certain degree of maturity. If only Marx's ambitions for England had been fulfilled.
Hey.
Marx is describing a bourgeois proletariat mindset. A big part of the bourgeois proletariat mindset is buying into these bourgeois myths and lies and slanders which divide workers.
Yeah.
You can't be comrades with that worker because he's from a different country from you. He's an immigrant. He's black. He's gay. These are all divisions that the bourgeoisie, through various means, and especially through media, what Marx calls mental production facilities, the means of mental production, basically through propaganda, they sow dissent and discord and disharmony among workers. And when you buy into this kind of crap, and when you become a bigot or a racist, or you hate another fellow worker because they're an immigrant or for some other such reason, you are taking the stand of the enemy. You are building a bourgeois proletariat mindset. You're siding with the bourgeoisie. Exactly. Okay? Now, this is from a publication from the Comintern in Germany in 1930. Okay, it's called I'm just going to call it The Black Worker because we've updated our language a bit since then. Development of the trade union movement is being described in this article. And I just think it's amazing because, first of all, this was being written in Germany in 1930 as the Nazis were rising to power. And as communists were, fighting tooth and nail for survival. Given that context, I find this to be a pretty amazing little educational piece that they put out about the development of the trade union movement. And the reason I want to read this is because I want to talk about how some of the ways in which even working class organizations like trade unions can take on bourgeois characteristics and ultimately serve the interest of the bourgeoisie. Even unions can do that. So in The Black Worker, they wrote, the development of the trade union movement continued side by side with the differentiation of the whole labor movement. This differentiation is to be seen in that labor movement of one country has completely different aims. Its character is different, and even its methods of organization differs from similar movements everywhere. In one country, England, for example, the aim of the movement was to get only a few small improvements in conditions, aka reforms. Yeah. There's no mass independent political party of the proletariat today in England. How the mighty have fallen. I mean, just in 1870, about 60 years earlier, Marx is writing about how there was the most revolutionary potential in England. Now there's no working class movement at all in England, right? There's no mass independent political party of the proletariat today in England. And in another country, to take Germany, we see the movement developing under the banner of socialism. A political party of the working class is built up, the unions being organized in the various industries, etc. Similarly, the movement being developed in France differs from the movements in other countries. Again, this is also sad because, 2 or 3 years later, the Nazis would take power and put all the communists in concentration camps. Yeah. So it's kind of very sad to read this now. Capitalism creates various conditions not only for workers in different countries, but for the various groups of workers inside one and the same country. Right? So that's why we have these different strata of workers, both internationally and within a nation, because people have different experiences and conditions, even though they're all proletariat.
Exactly.
This depends on the significance of the given group for the production process and on how quickly the members of these groups can be replaced from the reserve army of labor, the unemployed. This gives rise to a division in the working class between the better paid and the less paid workers. The better paid groups are better organized And thus we see the unions catering mainly for their interests, since the membership is made up mainly of these categories of skilled workers. If you really, really want to understand what we're talking about here, I definitely recommend you watch my 2-part documentary on the IWW back at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, and the way in which the IWW, the industrial workers of the world, fought tooth and nail to try to build one big union, which would allow workers from every sector and every industry to join so that they could, have general strikes and liberate the working class. And they got obliterated by capitalism and by trade unionism, which is exactly what this article is talking about. So the trade unions, their idea was, instead of having one big union and having all workers unite together, we will organize by trade. And if I'm a welder and you're an electrician, I only care about welders. You only care about electricians. I fight for my things. You fight for you things. There's not a whole lot of solidarity built into that trade union mindset. And that's exactly what this article is saying, right? The better paid groups are better organized, and we see the unions catering mainly for their interests. It becomes this kind of almost us versus them kind of mentality, instead of having the working class unite together. Now, one thing that's very interesting to note is that this is around the same time that the Vietnamese Union. What, you want to tell that history a little bit? The first Vietnamese Union?
Yeah, from around like the early 1920s, when the French colonialists opened factories in Vietnam and they forced our farmers to work as workers in those factories. They were poorly treated, just close to be slaves in those factories. In a factory called Ba Son in the south of Vietnam, a group of workers at first, they got together and they formed a union, a workers' union, and then the movement got so strong and so popular that in a matter of just like less than 10 years, nearly in every big factories owned by the French colonialists in Vietnam, we had workers' union over there. And the first union, we call it the Red Union, which is a pretty rad name. I love it a lot. From those unions, the workers get together, they educated each other, they trained each other in how to organize and taught each other about communism and socialism and revolution. And yeah, that was a start. The sparkle who starts the whole revolution and led to the independence of Vietnam in 1945.
And they were also very militant. They were actually
much.
like the first organized militant
Yeah.
groups that they actually, had little uniforms, and they fought and in the
They
revolution.
train each other in martial art and weapons using how to fight against our oppressors.
But all this is to say that all unions are not alike at all, because you see huge differences between the industrial unionism of the IWW in the USA versus like the trade unions in the USA, which the IWW was very class conscious. They wanted to unite the entire working class. They wanted to build one big union and overthrow capitalism, whereas the trade unions were basically collaborationists with the bourgeoisie. They didn't want to overthrow capitalism. They just wanted to make things better for their own specific trade. You can almost think of it more like a medieval guild mentality, where we just want to improve things for ourselves, got mine, F you kind of mentality.
Yeah.
And that's very different from the Vietnamese Red Union, which was explicitly communist.
Yeah.
They were trying to unite all the workers from all the different industries together. They did manage to do that. And they worked with the Communist Party, and they built an actual material base for a revolution that succeeded.
That history is really amazing, and I am actually very proud of it, because it started from just a small group of workers in the Ba Son factory. They started the first Red Union, and then it got spread all over the countries of Vietnam, and also each of them organized their own strikes. And then they joined together with a zero strike, many zero strike. And also at the same time, the women, students especially, students also had protests together to support the zero strike of the working class, of the workers. So that is how you see a huge movement of so many different groups of people that get together, and the core is the workers' unions.
This article continues, trade unionism is an ideological, political type of trade union organization based on a craft outlook. Again, that kind of guild outlook where it's like, we only care about our particular trade.
Yeah.
These unions have very narrow aims as regard improving working conditions, the rates of pay, and general economic positions of the working class. If they do resort to political action, it is only to protest the right of the unions to struggle within the framework of capitalism, not going outside of it. Trade unionism, which raised no independent political task for the proletariat, represents in reality the bourgeois policy of the working class. For under trade unionism, the working class and its unions completely support the bourgeoisie. So here you see what's ostensibly and nominally a working class organization, but it's actually a bourgeois proletariat organization which serves the interests of capitalism. Trade unionism arose as a specific type on the world labor movement thanks to the monopolistic position held by the British capitalism on the world markets throughout the 19th century and the influence the bourgeoisie were able to bring to bear on workers. In every part of the world, the workers in capitalist society, connected in 1,001 ways with the petty bourgeoisie, were subjected to the ideological and political influence of the bourgeoisie during the period when the workers' parties were being formed. This phenomenon, observed in all the capitalist countries, took on different forms in various countries thanks to the historical and economic conditions. With complete political freedom and the monopolistic position that England enjoyed for long past, the liberal bourgeoisie in England managed in a few decades to corrupt and influence the bulk of the class-conscious workers. This corruption and enslavement of the British workers was achieved by means of concessions that the British bourgeoisie were able to grant to the workers who put forward different economic demands. British capital was able to make certain concessions to its workers at home at the expense of its monopolistic position and the super profits it was squeezing out of the colonies. If you have colonial holdings where you're able to just siphon up huge quantities of wealth like the British Empire was able to do, and like the USA Empire does today, then you can give certain concessions to your workers at home. And now we see this now. If you watch our video on Bidenomics, which is just a new form of Reaganomics, which is just neoliberalism, you'll see that they're just trying to do this exact same kind of thing again today, where they're trying to give some concessions to American workers by quote unquote giving jobs to workers, by handing money directly to capitalists. You know, these are the ways in which the capitalist class in the imperial core has been able to build a bourgeois proletariat mindset among so many millions of workers, and has so many workers working against our own class interests. England was the workshop of the world so long as capitalism did not reach a high stage of development in other countries. Further, Great Britain owned many colonies. These conditions enabled the country to turn over an insignificant part of the super profits to the workers when the latter put forward their demands. Thus, in England, to use Engels' words, a bourgeois proletariat sprang up, convinced that it could improve its position within the framework of capitalism. Remember, as Marxists, as dialectical materialists, we want to have a historical perspective on how things develop. This gives you some idea of how this bourgeois proletariat mindset developed in the imperial core. I want to talk really quickly about some of the similarities between the petty bourgeoisie and the bourgeois proletariat. Both bourgeois proletariat and petty bourgeoisie have a lot of false consciousness. They misjudge their role in society and their place in capitalism. They both inaccurately believe that capitalism benefits them, when in fact ending capitalism is what would truly benefit both the petty bourgeoisie and the bourgeois proletariat. And they're both very difficult to win over to the side of communism because they fully believe that they're benefiting from capitalism. So they do have a lot in common, but they're not the same class from a material perspective. Antonio Gramsci also wrote a lot about this. One of the things he said was that in places like England and the USA, the bourgeoisie was able to culturally influence the workers a lot more through things like newspapers and radio and things like that. They were able to culturally dominate the working class. One observation he made was that one of the reasons that the Russian Revolution was more successful was because the Russian aristocracy, which was the ruling class along with the monarchy, because they didn't have a fully established bourgeoisie. And so Gramsci argues that that's one of the reasons that the Soviet Union was successful, whereas revolutions in other countries wasn't, because there wasn't so much cultural domination. The capitalist imperialist core has been able to buy out workers, basically, to build this bourgeois proletariat mindset, and not just bought them out, but they've also had decades and decades of very, very expensive programming, things like films, books, articles, radio programs, all kinds of things to build a bourgeois proletariat mindset among the working class of countries like the USA, England, France, the imperial core. So unfortunately, it's not only in the imperial core that we see bourgeois proletariat mindsets sneak in. That even today in Vietnam, Luna knows there are some bourgeois proletariat people here. Let's talk about some of this history in Vietnam, because I think it's interesting and it kind of sheds some more light on it. So first of all, here's a statement by Ho Chi Minh, which I think echoes what Marx was saying about English and Irish workers. If you recall, Marx had said that English workers look down on and despise Irish workers because they thought they were basically like these lesser people. They would dehumanize them.
Yeah.
And Irish people, of course, had plenty of reason to dislike those English workers who were dehumanizing them. And so they were fighting with each other instead of uniting together. Here's what Ho Chi Minh wrote about the proletariats in France and Vietnam back in like the 1920s and 30s. He said, "The mutual ignorance of the two proletariats gives rise to prejudices. The French workers look upon the native as an inferior and negligible human being, incapable of understanding and still taking less action.
Yes.
The natives regard all the French as wicked exploiters." This is like exactly the same dynamics that Marx saw between English and Irish workers. Imperialism and capitalism do not fail to take advantage of this mutual suspicion and this artificial racial hierarchy to frustrate propaganda and divide forces which ought to unite. Does that not sound like the United States of America's working class? I mean, all the division that we have along so many different fracture lines.
Yeah.
And, Ho Chi Minh identified it. Karl Marx identified it. Unfortunately, it didn't stop there. Unfortunately, going back to trade unions during the Vietnam War, you saw a huge bourgeois proletariat mindset with trade unionists during the Vietnam War.
Yeah. It was very upset to learn about this part of history that besides a lot of big anti-Vietnam War protests, at the same time, there are also thousands of workers in the USA in the 60s and the 70s supported the Vietnam War because it created jobs for them.
And the trade unions in the USA tacitly supported the Vietnam War because they were building weapons and munitions and making lots of money doing it.
And chemicals, toxins to kill. They did not care about the deaths of
their
millions
fellow workers in Vietnam.
of people in Vietnam. As long as it gives them jobs and incomes, they support it. It's really evil.
It's a bourgeois proletariat mindset. I mean, you can't get more bourgeois proletariat than that. It's siding with the capitalist class to kill and genocide workers on the other side of the world because you're making lots of money off of that. We're seeing that today, unfortunately, with the situation in Palestine, where American military-industrial complex is making millions of dollars. Every time Israel drops one of those American bombs, the military-industrial complex is getting a paycheck. And that's going to these workers, in the USA who have this bourgeois proletariat mindset where they'll keep making those bombs as long as those companies keep writing those checks.
Yep.
Unfortunately. Now, let's talk about some misconceptions about the bourgeois proletariat, okay?
No.
So one misconception is that the bourgeois proletariat has become a new class, like its own class. The term for this is the professional managerial class. And this is a term that was coined by John and Barbara Ehrenreich back in, I believe, the 1970s. They considered engineers, teachers, government workers, and accountants to not be proletarian. The PMC, the professional managerial class, cannot be considered a stratum of a broader class of workers because it exists in an objectively antagonistic relationship to another class of wage earners, whom we shall simply call the working class. So they're saying because these bourgeois proletariat, professional managerial class workers have some kind of antagonism with their fellow wage earning workers, they're no longer workers.
That is so weird.
Now, this is not a materialist definition.
No.
It is not rooted in Marxism or dialectical materialism in any way. It is based entirely on ideological constructs. It's not a material analysis.
Vibes.
It's all about vibes and feels. And it's basically, they're saying that like the PMC, the professional managerial class, don't vibe with workers, therefore they're not workers. Now, in this book, there is a chart, we'll put it on screen, that shows the relationship between the material and the ideological according to dialectical materialism.
According to dialectical materialism, material determines consciousness. But at the same time, consciousness can always impact back on the material. But you have to keep in mind that the material is the more important part in here.
Right. That's why we call ourselves dialectical materialists, because we believe that the material analysis is what's most important. That's why Marx and Engels define class structure under capitalism as capitalists and proletariat. And they saw this as like, a big opportunity for humanity, because once the proletariat unites and overthrows capitalism, that's the end of class society, because you just have one big class left over, which if there's only one class, then by
They say
definition, there's no class.
no class.
And that's all based on material relationships. Relations between workers and the means of production, the bourgeoisie and the means of production. That's very important. Those are material base of society relationships. Marx had this model of the base and the superstructure of society.
Yeah.
The base is what really drives things forward through history. The superstructure, the culture, they can impact back, but they're not the driving force. We define things by relationships.
Yes.
Okay.
By material relationships.
Material relationships especially are very important because material relationships are what drive material change and development. Okay. This PMC definition, which was coined by the Ehrenreich couple, they say that this class has two characteristics. This is their words, not ours. Okay. Quote, class is defined by actual relations between groups of people, not formal relationships between people and objects. Okay, so they're saying class is defined by
the
relationships
between,
people have with each other, not relationships with objects. They reduce the very important aspect of the means of production, the material base of society as outlined by Marx. They reduce that to mere objects.
This couldn't even be more wrong.
And I don't know how anybody can consider this Marxist analysis, to be honest, because it's purely based on ideological.
Yeah, this is idealist.
The second characteristic that they outline is the relations to economic foundations of society is not sufficient to specify a class as a real social entity.
What?
At any moment in its historical development, after its earliest formative period, a class is characterized by a coherent social and cultural existence. Superstructure.
Superstructure, literally.
Members of a class share a common lifestyle, educational background, kinship networks, consumption patterns, work habits, beliefs.
I can't.
These are all ideological characteristics, okay? And this is metaphysics. This is liberal metaphysics.
Do people really listen to this and like?
Oh yeah. It's a huge buzzword now of the professional managerial class. People talk about it all the time. People who call themselves communists.
I have a deeply concerns about the education situation in the West.
Well,
right now.
So to make you understand why Luna's so flustered right now and frustrated, and I am too, it's because this is literally what we would call idealism, because what they're saying is that what matters in all this calculus of trying to understand class are the thoughts in the heads of workers and the vibes and the feels that they have, not the material relations they have with the base of society. Okay?
Common lifestyle.
If you think that ideology is what drives reality forward, then according to Marxism, that makes you an idealist. In fact, I will now read the definition of idealism from the textbook that Luna translated. Idealism is a philosophical position which holds that the only reliable experience of reality occurs within human consciousness. Idealists believe that human reason exclusively or as a first basis is the best way to seek truth. That's exactly what this definition of the professional managerial class is rooted in. It's in human consciousness, human cultural, superstructural behaviors and activities, vibes and feels. Another thing I should say real quick, we call this liberal metaphysical thinking, okay, as opposed to dialectical materialist thinking. Metaphysics is this branch of philosophy, and this is from a Marxist perspective. There are many different ways to define metaphysics. This is how Marxists define metaphysics, where you try to break things up into categories, and you define those categories by characteristics. Now notice the words that they use themselves to define the PMC class is characteristics. They look at these two characteristics to define class. That's not dialectical materialism. That's not Marxism. We define things by relationships. Internal and external relationships. And that's why we say that the working class, the proletariat, is defined by its relationship to the means of production and to the bourgeoisie.
Exactly.
Okay? The working class works and labors using the means of production.
Yes.
They are exploited by the bourgeoisie who own the means of production.
Yes.
That's Marx's that's like capital. If I had to condense
it's capital 101.
That's like the main point that capitalism makes, right? I mean,
yes.
So how could you call yourself a Marxist and subscribe to this idealist, vibes-based definition of class. Another problem with the PMC is that it does not take into account development over time. And this is always the problem with metaphysical categorization and defining things by characteristics. It kind of defines everything as like static, unmoving, unchanging. Whereas dialectical materialism views everything as constantly changing and moving and developing. But this PMC definition doesn't account for development at all. So what was considered a PMC in 1977 is different from what might be considered PMC today.
Yeah.
In 1977, you know what a draftsman is, Luna? They had a big table and a big mechanical arm with a pen, and they would make mechanical drawings and architecture drawings and that sort of thing. In 1977, they would have been considered PMC. Today, they don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And a web developer didn't exist in 1977,
Yeah.
but they do exist today. It doesn't take into consideration development. The PMC class can't develop over time based on the definition that they've given, right?
Yeah.
So here's the claim that they make. The relationship between class as abstract economic relationship and class as real social existence has been all but unexplored.
Unexplored? Excuse
Gramsci
me?
explored this quite a lot, actually.
Literally, excuse me, Marx and Engels and Gramsci and Ho Chi Minh existed?
Yeah. But I think what's interesting about this claim is that they reframe the means of production, the most material, concrete, you can actually like touch and feel it, material part of this equation. They reframe it as simply abstract, right? And they call the means of production mere objects. They're dismissing the material aspects of Marx's class analysis completely. And they're building up the ideological, superficial, social, cultural consciousness relations, these vibes, as real. So they're saying the vibes are real.
And the means of production is abstract.
Okay, you know how Marx said that he took Hegel and turned it on its head?
Yeah.
So he took idealist dialectics and he turned it into materialist dialectics. He said, like, I turned it on its head. The Ehrenreichs have turned it back on its ass.
Oh my gosh.
They've taken Marxism and turned it back into this like
Hegel.
idealist dialectic analysis.
Yeah.
So their definition of PMC, you want to know their definition?
Oh
How
my
they
gosh,
define the professional managerial class?
I can't wait to hear that.
Salaried mental workers who do not own the means of production and whose major function in the social division of labor may be described broadly as the reproduction of capitalist culture and capitalist class relations. So in this idealistic, metaphysical way of defining things, they're saying that a copywriter in India, correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
if you have a copywriter in India working on Fiverr for $2 an hour, they're a professional managerial class because let's look at their characteristics.
Yeah.
They're not looking at things from a materialist perspective and they're not looking at things based on relationships. They're only looking at things from characteristics. So let's do the little checklist, the idealist metaphysical checklist. Does a Fiverr worker writing copy for $2 an hour in a developing country, are they salaried? Are they paid wages? Yes. Are they mental workers? Yes. Do they not own the means of production? Yes. Is their major function in the social division of labor broadly described as the reproduction of capitalist culture and capitalist class relations? Yes.
Yes.
So according to them, if you're making $2 an hour on Fiverr in a developing country, you're PMC. But if you're working on like an oil rig and making $150,000 a year, working with your hands like a man, wearing a boiler suit and carrying around big wrenches, you're a real worker. It doesn't make sense. There's not a material basis to this, and it doesn't stand to scrutiny. It also fails to account for change over time and development.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that metaphysical analysis is so useful for liberals is because if you're just defining things by characteristics and by vibes and feels and things like this, you can, shift things around.
Shift it. Add one characteristic or take one characteristic out, and it's like...
Or redefine it, or reframe it, like Biden's reframing neoliberalism right now. We have a video on that.
Yeah, exactly.
That's why debate and argument and words are considered relatively pretty useless by Marxists compared to material action and testing our ideas against material reality.
Because words can be changed easily, but the material base is just there.
Right.
And you just look at it, examine it, it won't change.
They have this like nebulous idealist construct, and it has to shift and change constantly over time and around the world because it has no material basis and it's rooted in characteristics instead of relationships rooted in material reality. So it's not Marxist analysis.
Nope.
Now, who or what gets defined as a PMC according to this definition is always up to debate.
Yeah.
And can and will fluctuate and change constantly or vary from one place to another. Now, I'm going to give you a little sneak preview to the Historical Materialism book, which as of the time of this video is not out yet. But that's the sequel to this book that Luna translated. By the way, you can get this book, the ebook, for free at bannionhouse.org. You can also, if you'd like to support us, buy a print copy. Totally up to you. Or you can print out a copy of the ebook that you get for free if you want. We don't care. But in the Historical Materialism book, which we are currently trying to finish up, they discuss this a little bit. I'm just reading from the Historical Materialism book that's not published yet. Early theories of history examined only the ideological motives of human beings without investigating the origins of those motives or ascertaining the objective laws governing the development of the system of social relations or seeing the roots of these relations in the degree of development reached by material production. In other words, this is a quote from, I believe, Marx and Engels. In other words, earlier conceptions of history and analysis of human society were looking at the ideological content of what the ruling classes were saying, instead of looking at material processes and material change over time and the material basis for those words. Earlier conceptions of human history overemphasized the ideological positions of humans, their consciousness, and ignored the material basis of those positions in the objective world, and this constituted an idealist conception of history. The earlier theories did not embrace the activities of the masses of the population, right? They didn't care about what workers were doing. They cared about what the ruling class was saying. They focused on the activities and lives of the ruling classes, which composed only a small minority of the human population of historical societies. This offered only a small glimpse of the whole of human history, and a biased glimpse at that, as it overemphasized the activities of the ruling minority while largely ignoring the activities and objective conditions and ideological development of the working masses. Marx explains why idealist notions of history are invalid. Marx considered the ideological output of society to be a poor basis for discovering historical truth because, as he wrote, just as our opinion of an individual is not based on what he thinks of himself, you might think you're really good at pool, but, you suck. We don't base our opinion on somebody by what he thinks of himself, so we cannot judge of such a period of transformation by its own consciousness. On the contrary, this consciousness must be explained rather from the contradictions of material life, from the existing conflict between the social productive forces and the relations of prediction. Boom. We cannot judge workers in the USA or India or Vietnam or anywhere based on their own consciousness. Especially when it's been so heavily altered through capitalist programming, through heavy indoctrination and propagandizement for so long. We cannot decide that they're a new class now because they don't vibe with this other element of the working class. We look at the contradictions of material life, the existing conflict between the social productive forces and the relations of production that cause those attitudes to begin, which is what the Black Worker article I read earlier did well. It looked at the material conditions of workers and it analyzed and explained why these fissures and divisions between workers were cropping up. That's what we as communists must do. It's what Karl Marx did, it's what Ho Chi Minh did, it's what Gramsci did, it's what we need to do today. We don't sit here and say, oh, these workers hate these workers, so they're different classes now. That's absurd. It's like saying,
I'm speechless.
It's like saying that you're in a different class because of your race or a different class because of your gender or something like that.
Right.
It's buying into the bourgeois bullshit. It's buying into the bourgeois proletariat mindset.
Exactly.
One last quote by Marx. Life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. In other words,
poetic.
We don't define class by the consciousness of workers, but we can understand where that consciousness comes from by looking at their lives. And we can see that the bourgeois proletariat, if you want to call them the professional managerial class, have obviously had different lived experiences than poor workers in factories in the developing world, for instance, right? They've had very different experiences, but they're both materially have the same relationship to the means of production and to capital. And therefore, they should be finding common cause with one another and uniting. We know that the Irish and the English in the 19th century had very different experiences. And we know that that made it difficult for them to come together and fight together. And I'll say this as like a white person, as a very privileged person, it's a lot bigger of an ask to ask oppressed people to unite with your oppressor. Because there are various vectors of oppression under capitalism by design. It's a lot harder to ask, in the 19th century example, an Irish worker to stand and fight alongside an English worker if that English worker is dehumanizing
Exactly.
them and telling them that they're like less than human, you know, and telling them that they don't belong in England, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, but it's a lot easier for the English person to go and take the side of the oppressed and to say, you know what, it's wrong the way that we're treating these workers, these Irish workers. And it's a lot easier in the context of Ho Chi Minh for a French worker to say, you know what, it's wrong the way that we're treating our fellow workers in Vietnam. And I would say today, it's a lot easier for me as a white American to say it's absolutely wrong the way that we're genociding Palestinians, our fellow workers in Palestine, than it is to ask them to come and fight for my cause as a white person in America. You know what I mean? So that's just some food for thought. If we want to heal these divisions, it's, I think, very much incumbent upon us as the more privileged to take that first step and finding common cause with oppressed people, you know, people that we benefit from the exploitation of. So what have we learned today? We basically have learned that some workers are jerks, but it's not necessarily all their own fault. They're jerks. They are class traders. They are compradors who work for the material benefit of the bourgeoisie because all their lives they've been indoctrinated. They went to school and they were indoctrinated. They watch movies and they're indoctrinated. It's not an accident that so many workers have taken on this bourgeois proletariat mindset. They've bought into this glitzy propagandistic version of the American dream that they can, you know, have a better life if they just sell out their fellow workers and buy into the bourgeois proletariat mindset. And this swindle has been going on for well over a century. Marx and Engels were describing it in the 1850s, so it's nothing new. And it's going to be very difficult for us to combat, but we have got to stop this kind of false consciousness in its tracks. It's very, very pernicious. It's very predominant in the imperial core. Yeah, it's a difficult thing. The only way to fight it is through education, through material organizing, building real unions and workers' councils that are not, that don't have this bourgeois proletariat characteristics, but have a real base, like the red unions in Vietnam, or like the industrial workers of the world in the 1910s, where they're really trying to unite all workers
a real
together.
solidarity between all the workers.
It's up to you to get out there and organize and build the material conditions for a working class movement that erodes and eradicates the bourgeois proletarian mindset. So I look forward to seeing what all of you do in the future to combat this kind of vicious false consciousness. I thank you for watching. That's all I got to say. You got anything else, Luna?
Just get together and stay strong and keep fighting.
Solidarity. Please check out Luna's translation. You can get the ebook for free, banyanhouse.org. I'm EJ.
I'm Luna.
Thanks for watching.
Bye.